This is another episode of Digital Diary. And, we've been doing this for a bit, and I think it's time to talk about who we are again. And then we're going to talk about loading our quilts, because another thing about us is we all do it differently. There's no one right way. So I'm Deanne Perigo, and I have a small boutique business in my home, and I do a lot of custom quilts and almost as many edge to edge, but it's kind of my niche in my area. So we also have Paige Johnson. Paige, tell us a little about you and your business.
Well, I have a storefront and I do have employees, and we run 5 long arms. The majority of the business is edge to edge overall, and I do a high amount of custom as well. But the thing that sets me apart is the sheer volume. So, I'm running about 110 quilts a month on average. So my setup and systems are based on what I need.
Oh.
And I'm in Minnesota.
I guess I didn't say I'm in Camas, Washington. So near Portland, Oregon. Christine, how about you?
I'm in Denver, and mostly I do lots of custom quilts, high-end like show quilts. But occasionally I'll need to sneak an edge to edge in there just to get it out of the way and done. So I always try to be flexible when I'm loading my quilts.
Oh, Karen, what's your business like?
So I have a little storefront in rural Missouri where I am usually the only employee running one or sometimes 2 machines. It depends on my setup at the time. And so I'm pretty much it, but I'm all about efficiency. So my loading method is based on what I've learned is fastest for me, maintaining quality, but fast. I like getting those quilts loaded on, getting to the fun part.
Yes. But as I said earlier, we all do it somewhat differently. So let's share my screen and we can look at some pictures and talk about that. Loading a quilt. One of the things we have to do, of course, is to prepare the quilt to go on, especially that back, because if we put a back on nice and straight, it's going to so impact the way that the quilting comes out. So Paige, this is one of your pictures. Tell us about it.
Yeah. Well, during the intake, I prepare the back. And for me, I don't ever square it up or trim off the edges. What I'm concerned about is the center of the straight grain. We do a lot of quilts that are preloaded before they're actually on the machine. So what I do is I start by taking where the selvage is, because that's really what I want to go along my bars. And I put those edges together, and then I follow that up until I have the fold. And so I'll find the fold on both sides. So go to the next picture. And this is a very large quilt. So I've got that fold and I'm putting it on the wall. I have a piece of foam on my wall and I just pin it on there, and I make sure that I have the center of the fold on the other side, and then I'll stretch that out so that I'm getting air in between there. If you pull the next picture, I think that's part of that. So I've got some air in there and I'm allowing that to fall down because they're not always straight grain. And that's what I'm looking for, is just the center of the straight grain. So then I'll fold that back so I have the 2 folded corners together. And then on the picture on the right, down at the bottom is going to be the center of my selvage. And so that's where I'm going to place 2 pins and move to the next picture. So here you can see at the top on the left, I have the folded edge, those corners, and they meet nicely. But if I follow that edge of the backing down to where the selvage is, you can see that those did not fall together. So what I'm more concerned with is not putting those edges. They want to be along the vertical on the right or on the left. The vertical on the left, I want that to all be level, but it's not necessarily even side to side. So I do have 2 pins in there, and that's what I'm going to consider the center of my straight of grain. One on the top and one on the bottom.
And that's where you center that with your leaders, right?
Yes, I do. I center that with my leaders. But I put not onto the leader itself, but I put onto a zipper. And I think we all have a totally different way to attach to the machine and how we do it. But my first step is to center the straight of grain on my back.
We put it on then very differently also, because Karen, this is one of your pictures. You want to tell us a little about that?
Yep. So actually, I almost always use a stapler to load my backings to my leaders. I do float, so I'm only loading my backing fabric to a leader, and I do that with a stapler. And so this is the stapler that I currently use, but any rechargeable automatic stapler would work really easily for this.
So are you starting with the back against the belly bar area or the back that's by the pickup roller?
I do start at the bottom of the backing, so I'm working there at the belly bar, and that's what this picture is. And I, unlike Paige, I don't ever find centers of straight of grain, centers of the backing, as long as I know it's large enough for the quilt. I know that it's on the correct direction, you know, if it's a directional backing. I don't worry about any of that. And I don't even worry about putting it on the center of my frame. I don't care if it's squared, as long as it has one sort of straight edge that I can staple to my leader at the belly bar. That's all that matters, because I let the backing speak to me. That's how I say it for the rest of the rest of the project. As I roll it onto that leader, like you can see right here, that backing is draped over the pickup roller now, and I just roll that front leader. And when that backing edge reaches an even level with the leader, then I stop rolling and I staple the top of my backing. Yep, and this picture shows this particular backing wasn't cut straight. So it was shorter in the center than on the edges, and I simply just fold that extra fabric up and staple it like it is. So I save all that time squaring backs. I save all of the time straightening them. I don't even press backs usually. If I need to get wrinkles out, I spritz them with water and let them sit on my frame for a few minutes. I don't use an iron. I refuse.
I'm with you there. I spray it down with starch alternative, I guess you would call it. So yeah.
Yeah, I use plain water. Yep, I'm with you, Karen.
And we can also pin, and this is the same sort of thing that you were talking about, Karen, where it hangs out over the the pickup bar. Pin it on first at the bottom and then roll it. But pinning is my thing. It takes a little bit longer, but I just get a better feel of what the quilt's going to be doing. I just kind of touch-feely that way, I guess. So this is how I pin it to the pickup bar. It's very similar to what Karen does with her stapler, but just with pins. And I have one of these magnetic pin bowls, and it can sit on any of the bars, just right there where I am. But there is a rule in my studio. There is no blood. So no poking myself with these pins.
I don't know how you get away from that. We always say blood is part of quilting. You make pain your friend.
But
I'm
Paige,
kidding.
this is how you do it because you were
Yeah,
talking about it.
because I'm dealing with more volume, and we will set up our backs ahead of time, and we sew the zipper, and this is a zipper to the back, and we're using a chain stitch machine. So to take that off, you pull one thread and it just kind of unravels like a dog food bag. And we start by finding, because I do have the center marked, and then the center is marked on the zippers, and the zippers are sewn on. There's a male and a female on each backing, and then we also have a male and a female sewn directly to the leaders on the machines. So we will just pull that off. It's all set to go.
Way faster when you've got a lot of people using a lot of different machines.
Yeah, because then it does help on the loading, and it's volume. I used to pin exactly the way you did, Deanne, and volume is what made me move to this.
There's another way of basting to the leaders.
Yep. So this is one of mine. And this is kind of, and I know Andrew has demonstrated this method where he uses the clamps from both sides to clamp onto both sides of the leader. And then you use the channel lock in your basting stitch to go ahead and actually baste it onto your leaders. It can be relatively fast. I mean, you are sewing through your leader, but I'm just using the big 1-inch stitches. But in this case, I typically load with red snappers. But in this case, I didn't leave myself enough room. This was one of my quilts. And so when I got to the end, I had to change it up because I was hitting that red snapper. And so I just unzipped that leader, put a different leader on, and use that base to the leader method that Andrew likes to do, where you clamp the sides of the leader up and use that channel lock and basted it right to it, and it gave me a couple extra inches. So,
And I love how
found
you
that
can use,
I like to be flexible in how I load my quilts.
Yes. And moving on to loading the batting, because we've got our backs on now and we're putting our batting on. Do you do it differently with each quilt, or do you do it the same? This is one of my pictures. I sometimes will, if it's like a minky backing where it's really slippery, I will baste across the batting with my channel locks on to give it a straight line and hold it there while I bring the top over. Sometimes though, I'll just use channel locks and go straight to the top and right across. But Paige, in your picture, it looks like you use your clamps to hold it on.
Well, actually, I load before the batting, I load my top because our tops are all loaded. I find the center of the top and I put that on and I roll it up onto the bar. And after the top is loaded, the back is loaded, then I load the batting. And I will baste in with a channel lock across the top. My clamps, generally speaking, hold the batting and the backing, and in the best of all possible worlds, the batting is the same size as my back, so I know if it's migrating in or out as I advance my quilt. But I am a full load, and that top is pinned to the leader, so I use all 3 leaders. And the batting here is tucked in between the bars so that the top and the back will roll off the bar and the batting is hanging.
I love that you get to use pins sometimes.
I use pins all the time.
Well, here's the picture of it, a full load, like you described. Magnets. Sometimes I use magnets. How many of you use magnets? Ever?
Yep, we
I
use them.
just like this when I float the tops to keep tension on that top. Yep.
I use them on round tree skirts.
Yes, but I put them down here on that bar that doesn't roll. It's very stable. It's a smaller one. Some people put them up here. Where do you guys put them?
Same place you do, for the same reason. They're out of the way, and that bar does not roll.
Because if you put them on the belly bar, they like to roll under.
Yes. And I also found that if I had a necklace on, it would attract my necklace.
Oh, never done that.
Clamps or the clips, I guess we call them, the gamble clips.
I use these if I ever have to put something back on, if I've found something I need to fix, or for whatever reason we put a quilt back on. I use them for that.
Well, and when we were on tour, we used them almost exclusively to load the quilts when we were on tour.
Mm-hmm.
If I have a backing that's a lot bigger than the quilt top, I use the quilt clips. It's fast.
And see, I use the quilt clips almost all the time because I like protecting the quilt top, especially on those custom quilts when I'm doing a whole bunch of special attention. Then I'm not, rubbing up against that belly bar all the time. It kind of protects the quilt.
Oh yeah, because on the high-end custom, you are right there touching that quilt and leaning on it.
Yep.
Also protect my clothes. I found I was getting little holes in my clothes from rubbing against quilts all the time, or pins or whatever, and they protect me as well.
Yep, they go right over the top of those pins. I love it. I only pin when I have to.
And a complete float. Anybody do a complete float? I don't normally, but I would float it if I was going to then move on to baste the entire quilt. I would leave it like this.
So a lot of times I'll baste in the entire quilt ahead of time. So I float it to baste it in. But there are on occasions where I will actually float the entire top. And it really comes down to what that quilt is and how I'm quilting it. So if I'm just doing a quick edge to edge all over kind of thing that I know is going to go really quick, a lot of times I'll just float it. One of the other times I'll float it is if I'm doing really heavy, dense matchsticking. And I know I'm going to get a lot of that shrinkage.
I was just going to say, when you're floating, aren't you getting more shrinkage with heavier quilting?
Surprisingly, with the quilt clips, not as much. It actually helps keep it really straight and square with those quilt clips. And quite frankly, if there is any shifting, I want to be able to account for it and not have to deal with readjusting pins and stuff.
Well, with the quilt clips, let me go back a couple pictures here. One of the things that I like with is you can place them where you need them. Same with magnets. So if you have a lot of extra area in your border that you need to suck up a bit, you've got just too much compared to the center, I'll leave the clips off of that area. And then it will just draw it up a little bit more than it will in the center where it's more stabilized.
That's a great way to deal with areas that are fuller.
Mm-hmm. But basting the entire quilt.
Yep. So what I like about basting my entire quilt in before I actually put any stitches in it is I make sure that I loaded the backing the right way. I made sure I loaded the batting the right way, right? Because we've all done that. We've all gotten to it and wait, I loaded it the wrong way. So everything matches up. I have enough batting, I have enough backing, everything is square and even. And the best part, as long as I'm careful when I'm doing my rolls, I can go back and forth depending on where I need to start quilting that quilt. So especially when I'm doing like some of the stitch in the ditch or some of my big crazy modern designs, I need to be able to move from one section of the quilt to the next. And so that's what allows me to do that. And you can see I have my red snappers on. I love my red snappers, mostly because I've actually accidentally popped them at one point. I've tightened that quilt top just too much and popped those red snappers right off. This was in the early days. And so I like using them just because it's a reminder for me not to over tighten my quilts, to keep them loose and drapey so that I don't pop those snaps.
Right. I like to completely baste if I have a top that needs to match particular spots in the backing. So if they have pieced the backing and want it to fit within, maybe they have borders on the back or something, I will start by basting right through that center, and then baste going toward the top, and then baste going toward the bottom. And then I know that it's all going to fit right exactly where the customer wants it to.
Yeah, centering the back is where I will baste, and I am not a baster. We all do things differently, but that is my method for centering.
And it allows you to do on a custom quilt, like all one color thread at a time, and then move on and do all of another thread at a time. Start wherever you want, like Christine said. Here's another picture of your basting.
So a lot of times when I'm basting in my quilts, I'm using lots of batting. So I'm doing, 2 layers of batting, a cotton and a wool. And so I want to make sure that that wool, and especially at this quilt, it had wool next to linen. So that's really slippery. So I wanted to make sure it doesn't shift around or slip or anything. So you can see I've already started doing all of my ditch work in this picture, but I still have some of those basting stitches in just to keep all that background from slipping around and sliding.
And you have a lot of background.
There's a lot.
Well, this is something that I do occasionally, is putting multiple quilt tops on a single back. I know that for me, it saves my customers money. If they have a bunch of small quilts, then they're not paying the minimum charge for each quilt. Whereas we can add up all the square inches and charge by that. And it saves them quite a bit of money. It saves me time.
Yeah, this works great, especially when you have wide backings. We do a lot of multiple quilts on one back.
Yep.
So I've even done, go for it.
So this is really an example of, multiple quilts side by side, but I've also done them one right after the other too.
Mm-hmm.
It just depends on how big that backing is, and if you can run that design over both quilts or whatever your options are.
Sometimes what we'll do with multiple small baby quilts is sew the backings together and load them so that the seams are parallel to the bars. And that way we can change up the design on the next quilt and as it rolls up.
Mm-hmm.
So I've done a similar thing with 2 separate backings, but they're similar size backings. And so the way I load my backings, it doesn't matter if they're exactly the same size as long as they're pretty close. And I can actually load 2 different pieces of fabric side by side, and then load the quilt tops and set up 2 edge-to-edge quilt groups in Creative Studio and stitch 1 set of repeats or 1 set of rows and the other set of rows and do that. And since I have a 14-foot frame, I can do that with pretty good sized quilts side by side.
How do you deal with the center area between the 2 quilt backs to keep it stable?
I usually make sure my batting's a little bit wider than my backing, and then I'll just pin the 2 battings together at the center.
Ah.
I just put them so close together that they either the backings reach or the battings reach, and then I just weave a little pin in there. It's probably the only time I use pins in my studio.
So creative. Christine, I learned this from you last week.
So since I float and since I like to completely baste in the quilt ahead of time, I can actually use one of my bars to store a quilt I'm working on. And if I need to run a quick edge to edge or something, I can roll it up and put something else on my other leaders and run a different quilt. And then when I'm done, I'll just go and put the other quilt back up, zip it back on, and we're ready to go. So I can keep like a big custom job that's taking me a long time on one of my bars. And then like if I need to get it in a quick edge to edge, I can go put it on the other bar, get it done. And then when it's done, I can just go put my leader back up, zip it on, and I'm ready to go.
It's like having a hidden compartment.
I
I take my show quilts off and hang them on the wall and then put them back on. With the
don't
zipper,
have room to hang them on the wall.
yeah, no, I've got the room. But with zippers, doesn't matter what zipper you're using, you're going back at about a 1/16 of an inch of where you came off because the teeth bring it back to where it was.
Well, and in this case, I knew that the quilt I was putting on was going to take a little bit longer. And unfortunately, the quilt that I had on that was already loaded on that top bar. So I actually wrapped it in plastic to kind of help protect it while I put the other quilt through.
That's kind of cool.
So those are a lot of different ways of loading a quilt. What are some of the specialty things that may impact how you load a quilt, like minky?
Well, minky, we load, well, I always do things different than other people. I'm sure this is one of them. We put the salvage of minky along the leader. And that means the greatest stretch is going between the two bars. But I feel that I have more control when my stretch is going this way because you can just back off and we don't tighten the minky as much. And if the greatest stretch is going side to side, then you have a tendency to pull it with the clamps on the side. Mm-hmm. And sometimes minky is stretchy and the clamps will actually weight it down. I saw in one of your pictures, Christine, you had a ruler underneath those clamps. Mm-hmm. Well, we turn that strap around and we pin minky instead of using the clamps because the clamps get heavier and we just don't tighten it as much.
Because you don't want that hourglass look when you're done with it.
No, when the sides start curling, you have it too tight.
No, I've actually taken a quilt off in my earliest days and it turned over because I had it stretched too tight and it literally started curling in on itself.
Yep.
But I do load the stretch to the leaders. So I do it the opposite way of Paige, but there's not a right or wrong. My way works for me and Paige's way works for her shop. So.
Yep. And I use those yardsticks just to help with the weight of those clamps on quilts that are in the center of my frame, those smaller quilts, just so those clamps don't pull it down as much.
Mm-hmm. I use the yardsticks on the sides to keep everything level as well, because those clamps can be kind of heavy and droop things. But when I use not necessarily minky, but maybe something that stretches both directions, like a fleece or something, I will put rulers under my clamps so that I have a 12-inch ruler and I clamp to that, and it keeps things from twisting and turning and on the sides.
That's a good idea. Do you use two rulers then, one on the top and one on the bottom, and clamp them So it's like a little vice grip.
No, because I don't think I could do that. I don't think my hands would do that. I've got so much arthritis that just getting one on top and clamping on is about as much as I can do. But that's just one of the little, I have no idea where I learned that trick. But what other things do you do? Because we get some crazy things that we quilt sometimes.
Well, piece backings can be an issue, especially when the seams are going in a lot of different directions. I try to have the majority of the seams running parallel to the bars, not perpendicular.
So does that, how you choose to load a quilt? Do you have it go top to bottom, or you turn it sideways and have it
The
go?
backing generally determines how we're going to load the quilt. There's rare instances where you have a quilt that has a quilting design that is directional, that has to go a certain way, but the majority of our overalls are non-directional in quilting designs. It's very possible and happens frequently where the top and the back are directional to one another. So they might be loaded this way or they might be loaded that way. So however the back goes, that's how I rotate the quilt so that it lines up the top and the bottom correctly.
So I have a question for you, Paige. You turn your quilts to do borders a lot, right?
Yes.
So do you sew on a new zipper every time?
We pin those on then.
Okay.
And the pins don't have to be as close together as the zipper. And it's just what you get used to. We're fairly quick in doing it. They come off and we do trim the sides at that point. So we're 1.5 inches, 2 inches away from the edge of the border, and find a new center and pin that zipper back on.
I just thought I'd check since you have different ways of doing things.
Yeah, well, it's consistent. I mean, it is different, but like Karen says, she has things that work for her. They work for us, and it's consistent, and it doesn't matter who's working on the quilt. We're all doing it the same way.
I usually do things depending on how I have to quilt things on the quilt. So I like to, like Paige, I like to load the back depending on how the back is constructed. Sometimes that means loading the quilt sideways. Sometimes in order to quilt something, because I do some crazy quilting, I need to load the quilt sideways to start with. So sometimes the quilting design will tell me which way to load it, and sometimes I listen to the backing.
Mm-hmm. I started out as somebody who chunked down the borders. And so if I could load it wherever the longest border was and have that horizontal, that I would do that. What about you, Karen?
Oh, unless I'm using a directional edge to edge, I will load the quilt the long way, unless I have a reason not to, so that I can have the fewest rolls as possible. And most of what I do is edge to edge. So and when I'm custom quilting, I can almost always put it on sideways, the long way, so that fewer rolls.
Mm-hmm. Anything else that you can think of that, especially a new long arm quilter would want to know about loading?
Well, I'd say try different methods. I mean, we've definitely given you some here, and find something that works for you. Once you do it and do it consistently, your muscle memory kicks in, so that you are doing the same movements over and over again, and it does become quicker.
Because I know the first time I took a long arm class, we did a full load and with pins. And it actually kind of turned me off of long arm quilting for a while. And so when I went back and actually ended up buying my machine, they had the red snappers, and I was like, oh, wow. So that was really cool. And so I actually only keep those red snappers on one set of my leaders, so that if I want to roll up a quilt and work on something else, then I have to use my pins. And I don't like using pins. So it's kind of my little incentive to myself to finish what I'm working on before I squeeze something else in.
See, that's funny. I am so fast with pins, and it's only because, you know, you do several thousand quilts and you get fast at it.
Yep.
And I know you guys are really opposed to it. I just think, it's not that big of a deal. I do it every day.
And it's not that I think it's a big deal, because pins are okay, but for me, my method is just twice as fast. But that's why I, like Paige, would just encourage people, whether you've been loading a certain way for 2 weeks or 10 years, you know, you might want to try something new. Just try different methods and you'll find something that you really love.
Well, and like that one quilt where I was using my red snappers and it wasn't giving me enough room. I didn't leave myself enough space and I had to find a new way to do it. I went and used the, channel locks on my machine and basted it right to the leader. So just be open to trying something different.
Yeah. So there's no one right way of loading a quilt. I mean, sometimes it's the quilt or the backing that tells you how to load it, and sometimes it's just your favorite way of doing it. So I hope you all learned something. I did. I learned something every time that we get together. So thank you, ladies. And come on back for the next one. So from Digital Diaries, I'm Deanne. We have Paige and Christine and Karen. And see you later. Bye.
Bye.